Okay, great. We're back here again. Second examination's over, and I hope you did very, very well on that exam. Today we're going to be starting Chapter 10. This is lecture number 18 of the 26 that you'll have. If you're in the Monday, Wednesday section, I think you only have 24. So anyway, I want to talk to you a little bit about population. I'm going to go back and forth on the camera here. And if we look here, let me get my camera adjusted properly here. And from 1840 to 1860, our population increased dramatically in our country. Let's just take three random cities. Of course, these are large cities that we have. But we had New York from 1840 to 1860. Population, as you can read it here, 312,000, 805,000. Philadelphia's population went 220,000, 565,000. Boston, 93,000, 177,000. Those are small places by today's standards. But where did these immigrants come from? Well, where did our population increase come from? I'm in Chapter 10 in your textbook, and I'll just try to show this to you. Notice here, and I'm having to read this upside down, and I can't read it very well. But by 1860, we had a population increase that was something like 31 million. Where are the people coming from? Well, much of the population, if we look over to the opposite side here, which is on this side, we can see that it came from immigration. I know you can see this very, very well with me moving it around like I'm moving it, but immigration will contribute significantly to the population increase. And where are these people coming from? Once again, we'll stay with our textbook here. And if you have your textbook, you can look at it and follow along. Since everything is backwards, it's hard for me to identify these places, but you'll see that 40% of the population came from Ireland. That's my ancestry. I'm proud of that. And if you look over to Germany, that's 27% of the population. England had, I believe it's 18%. I can't really read that. And other Scandinavian, Northern European countries will contribute to the rest. So the majority of our population is coming from Ireland. Many, many reasons for that. Primarily it's because we had the potato blight that was taking place in 1844 to 1844, in that time frame right there. Alrighty, so let's go back to our camera here as we kind of lighten up a little bit for the time being. In fact, this is a pretty easy lecture to master. And at earlier times, we talked about the improvements in transportation. We had steamboats that were produced here, and many, many steamboats. About 60 of those were on the Ohio River and the Mississippi River during the time frame we're talking about here. We also had improvements in road transportation, crushed rock, hard packed surface. You're all familiar with that. But we're likewise going to see in about the 1820s, we see a canal age. And let me share some figures with you on this, and it's kind of interesting. If we take 4 horses and we tie those 4 horses together, harness them together, and they can haul 1.5 tons of freight. I don't know if you can read my writing very well there, but 1.5 tons of freight on a crushed rock, hard packed surface. That's a turnpike, and can transport those goods 18 miles a day. And I kind of like that. I'm kind of impressed with that. On the other hand, if we can take those same 4 horses and harness them together, if you will, they can haul 100 tons of freight 24 miles a day on a canal. Now I'm asking you, which way, if you're a businessman, which way do you want to transport your goods, given the preference here of by horses, or if you had the availability of a canal? So let me show you how it is here, and if I had a whiteboard in front of me, I could show you this a little bit better. But this is how you work this now. This is a canal. This is an actual canal boat. And in fact, this is just used for tourism today up at Coshocton, Ohio. But notice where the horse is located. They have one horse there and a rope that is tied to the canal boat, a person that is walking with a horse there, leading the horse along, and of course you have to dredge out the undergrowth here that hangs over the side of the canal or over the river, whatever it might be. And you just pull that canal boat, which is full of goods, and pull that along for 24 miles a day with 100 tons of goods. And it's pretty good. It's a good means of transporting your goods with that. All right, now, none of you probably have seen canals, or very few of you probably have. We don't have these in the South. And if you thumb back over to your textbook and go over a couple of pages, you can see some of the, you can see a map there that shows you many of the canals that were constructed there. We don't see them in the South. If you go to Europe today, you'll find a lot of canals that are present there on the river system. Now, one of our best was a canal which is called the Erie Canal. And again, you'll need to use your textbook to identify where this is. It will run from Lake Erie all the way down to Albany, or roughly where Albany, New York is. That's where the Hudson River is located. The construction on this canal began on the 4th of July. Everything happens on the 4th of July in 1817, and we would open up the Erie Canal on October 1825. It covered 364 miles. It crossed 18 rivers, had 88 locks with it. And if you were in class, I would try to show you how locks work, but being in the environment that we're in right now, it's kind of difficult to do that. Basically, what happens here is you can actually move a boat through rapids, which was previously rapids, and actually move it up. You can increase the elevation. Boats don't do very well trying to go upwards in elevation here. You also do the reverse here, where you can ship goods on a canal boat, and actually go from higher elevations down to lower elevations. All right. Now, the Erie Canal cost $7.5 million. It was an engineering marvel. It paid for itself in 7 years. And if you're traveling up into central parts of New York today, you can actually see the Erie Canal. I don't know if you'll be very impressed with it. I was up in New York 2 summers ago, and actually saw it right then. It just looks like a river, to tell you the truth here. All right, so anyway, that was that. We're also going to see improvements in transportation in the way of railroads. The Iron Horse. The Iron Horse first came out. The railroads first emerged in the 1820s in England. It had slow growth for the first decade or so, but by 1840 in the United States, we had 2,818 miles of railroads. Look at the map that's in your textbook here, folks. By 1850, there was 9,000 miles of railroads. 1860, 30,000 miles of railroads. And I'll go ahead and just tell you right now here, folks, by the turn of the century in 1900, next semester I will tell you this, you had 220,000 miles of railroads in our country. Now, if you look at the map of the railroads, you'll see that most of these railroads are located in the north. Most are located in the north. Now, the few railroads that we have in the south, by and large, run east to west. Now, this is going to be a big factor when we get into the American Civil War, because when we get into the Civil War, we had the North against the South, of course, as you well know with that. And these armies of the North and the South are going to be trying to use the railroads for logistical purposes. So in the North, you have many railroads there. They're running in every direction, so it's easy to transport your war materials up to the front. For the South, their railroads run largely east to west. And so that makes it quite difficult for the South to supply logistically to the soldiers that are on the battlefield. So anyway, and that was that. All right, so let's go back to our camera right here, and let's see where we are. I'm going to leave that, and let's see what else we have here. We're also going to see the emergence of textiles. Now, just like we had at Slater's Mill, and I didn't bring out an article for you to look at here, but at Slater's Mill, we had our first spinning mill, and it's going to grow enormously here, folks. They're going to increase in size. You have one which is located at Lowell, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. It's still present there today. It's not in operation. It's part of the National Park Service today, but it's referred to as the Boston Manufacturing Company, in which you would have spinning and weaving would actually take place under one roof. Spinning is to make the yarn, weaving is to make the cloth. You would have unmarried women or married women that would work in these facilities here and putting out the finest goods that they could do, that they could manufacture. Some of the other things that we're going to see to emerge from this period of time. In 1831, Cyrus McCormick developed his wheat reaper, and this wheat reaper, which would, you could actually, how shall I put this, harvest 3 times the amount of wheat by using this wheat reaper as you could by the use of hand. All right, so let's see what else we're going to have here. Now, another problem that we have, another individual associated with this, was Samuel F.B. Morse. And remember the problem that we had before with the Treaty of Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans? We've got a communication problem here. We don't have radios at that time. There's no telephones at that time. So what Samuel Morse developed a telegraphy system here. So we can send messages by telegraph. It's kind of like telephone in a way. Now, what I want to show you here is he developed what was called Morse code. And if any of you know Morse code, I will will be very, very impressed with this. It is dying art here. I know the code. My dad knew the code. My grandmother knew the code. My great-grandfather knew the code. It was just everybody in my family were all very good with Morse code here. In fact, when I was in Boy Scouts, it was a requirement for you to get first class that you had to know Morse code. And my 5 years that I was on the camp staff at Camp Horn, that's what I taught. I taught Morse code here. I had my own radio license, and I would sit at home at night. I'd made my own transmitter. I'd made my own receiver here, and I had my ham operator's license there. And I would sit at home at night, and I would play with my key and my rig, as they called it back then. And you'd send messages off to God knows where, and somebody would pick up my message, and they would send it back to me. And we would do this back and forth. It's kind of like what we all do today with Facebook here, but that's the way it was done. So let me go back here and show you how we do this. In Morse code, you have two designations here. You have a dot and you have a dash. A dot and a dash. So let me move my oscillator here over so you can see this, and this is old. It doesn't work very well. Now, back in the times in which I had my ham operator's license, we used one of these, and I'm going to use a little oscillator over here. It works a little bit better. And it doesn't work very well. Speaker's not well, but let me show you. If I want to make a dot, it's like that. If I want to make a dash, it's like this. Okay, so every letter in the alphabet is represented by a code. And you can see here, I pointed it out to you, that an E is a single dot. If we want to make an O is a. If I want to make an H is such as that. And if I want to do an L, it's such as that. Everybody got it? Isn't that simple? Isn't that simple? All right, now what I want you folks to do, since you're now telegraphers, is I'm going to send you a message. So, prepare to copy code. Prepare to copy code. All right, here it goes here, folks. All right, that last one was... Okay, so what was the message that I sent to you good folks? Hello. Hello. All right. And that's the way the system works. And it's kind of fun here, folks. So what you have your telegraph line. And this telegraph line, which stretches from Jasper, and it goes to Carbon Hill, for example. So we go down to the train depot where we have a telegrapher, and we have our message that we want to send. And we give that message to the telegrapher, and we probably have to pay a little bit for it. And he sends it out. And we have a telegrapher that's up in Carbon Hill that picks up that signal. And the telegrapher in Carbon Hill then forwards that signal on up to, shall we say, Tupelo. And from Tupelo, it goes to Memphis. And from Memphis, it goes to St. Louis. And it goes across the country. All right, you get the idea of what I'm talking about? So anyway, it was a very efficient means of communication with that. Morse code. It is a dying art. All right, so let me go back to my camera here, and that's kind of fun to go through that little exercise with that. All right, Samuel F.B. Morse here. Now, we're also going to see with more industrialization to take place of factory workers, and we'll just flood into America here. At first, from 1820 to 1830, most of these factory workers were just people that lived in the United States. They were native born here. But as more and more immigrants come into the country, we have, you'll see by 1840s on anyway, most of the workers in the factories there are immigrant workers. And many times what you'll find there is entire families, husband, wife, all the children, they don't go to school, all the children, they'll just work in the factories, in the textile mills. Okay, so let's move on and lighten it up a little bit here. And we're still taking a look at life as it is in about the 1820s to the 1840s. So how did people entertain themselves? Well, largely it was through blood sports. Got to have a little blood. That's what makes it entertaining, right? And they did such things as cockfighting. Thank goodness we no longer have cockfighting here in Alabama and Walker County. I'm saying that facetiously, folks. We probably have a monopoly on it here in Alabama. Ratting, that's where you take male rats, and male rats fight to the death here. Dog fighting. And thank goodness we don't have that anymore. Well, ask Michael Vick about that. But yeah, we do. And bet on this, of course. Boxing. Certainly, boxing was quite popular, even though it was illegal in a number of states here. One of the most memorable fights took place in 1842. The Englishman, Thomas Lilly, knocked down the Irishman. It was Christopher Lilly, knocked down the Irishman, Thomas McCoy, 80 times. The fight ended in round 119 when the Irishman was killed. All right. So anyway, we also entertained ourselves with minstrel shows. This is not something that would be permissible in our society today. It would be deemed to be highly racist. And what you had here, folks, you had white entertainers that were dressed in blackface, that had their faces darkened here, portraying themselves as African Americans, and it was dancing and singing and that sort of thing. They were called minstrel shows here. You always had the same cast here. You had Tambo and Bones and Mr. Interlocutor. All right, this will eventually evolve into vaudeville, and that will lead into the kind of comedy that we have today anyway. All right, we also entertained ourselves with the penny press. I don't think I need to tell you the price of a newspaper here, and it's self-explanatory. Penny press. You had many of these, kind of like the Philadelphia Gazette. Bold, sensationalistic headlines, all designed to dupe that person into buying the newspaper. Female child with 2 heads. Fishes traveling on water. Raffling for babies. Lake surfing. Dreadful steamboat disaster. Boy trapped in refrigerator. Eats on foot. Now, where do we find those publications today? Well, I think you'll find them up at places like Walmart here, folks. Make sure you wear your mask when you go in there. All right. So anyway, those are the types of ways in which people entertain themselves. And very popular. One of my favorite, P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum here. Phineas Taylor Barnum. And he had his circus, so to speak, here, the greatest show. Some of you probably seen that, watched the movie. It's one of my favorite movies here. P.T. Barnum. He had just a cast of entertainers, a pituitary dwarf, Tom Thumb, you know, the bearded lady. We had the dog-faced boy, ventriloquist, trapeze artist, Siamese twins, and we could just go on and on and on with that. Anyway, it's a good movie. I kind of like that. Okay, so we're going to leave that chapter. That's a short chapter. And let's move on from that chapter, and we'll go into another section. This is chapter 11 in your textbook here, folks. Again, it's not a very long chapter. We're going to move kind of rapidly through some of these. And anyway, the title of the chapter is Cotton, Slavery, and the Old South. All right, sensitive issues here. And let's see what I have here. Now, for the South, and that's what we're talking about, it was primarily an agrarian society. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about with agrarian is farming society here. We're still an agrarian society in the South today, not as much as we were before 1860 or slightly after 1860 anyway. All right, so in the South we grew such crops here as sugar, sugarcane, rice, and those were primarily in the deep South here. In the upper South, you had tobacco. Tobacco depletes the soil so rapidly, so that often you'll find that these farmers would move away from tobacco and go into raising wheat here. And also we had cotton. And cotton. Of course, this came after 1793 when Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin. All right, so moving right along here. So we're going to divide the South here into Upper South and Lower South. Now, I don't feel like going back to my map here, folks, so it'd be too much trouble for us to do that. So why don't you imagine here like the Upper South would be Virginia and Maryland, maybe North Carolina. And then the Lower South would be Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina here. All right, so we had like 2 different types of South here. Now, before we had the development of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, the Upper South was dominant, and the Lower South was less than that so. But with the development of the cotton gin, and now I am going to go to my camera here and go to my map here if I can do so here, folks. But now what we'll find is that as cotton production, let me get this right for you folks, cotton production will begin to move in this fashion right here. South Carolina into Georgia, on into Alabama, and Tennessee, Mississippi, and on in this direction right here. And what you'll likewise find is that slaves will follow the same path. In other words, as cotton production moves in this direction here, white population moves in this direction here, and for southern slave owners, they bring their slaves with them. So population in the South moves like that. All right, so anyway, and what that's going to bring about, that's going to bring about a shift in the economic importance, whereas the Lower South will eventually surpass the Upper South in importance. All right, so let's take a look here, and let's see where I am here. And I'm talking about cotton here. And from 1820s to the 1830s, most of the cotton that was harvested in the South, it was exported into England or even into France. But by and that's for their textile mills, by the way. From the 1840s into the 1850s, most of the Southern cotton that was exported, it went to spinning mills, which were present up in New England, like the Boston Manufacturing Company that I told you earlier. All right, so anyway, let's move on with this, and let me show you a couple of interesting little tidbits of information here. I don't know if any of this is in your textbook. This comes from some of my other sources here. But by 1850, cotton was the #1 Southern export. But even more remarkable, by 1860, cotton was the #1 U.S. export. The #1 export in the U.S. It was controlling the U.S. economy. And many people believed that cotton was king, that we had King Cotton. And many people in the South mistakenly believed that they could use that as leverage against the North. In other words, cotton can be held over the North head here, and we can use it as economic sanctions against the North, and that turned out to be a myth. Other sources of cotton could be taken from India, Egypt, and such as that. All right, so anyway, let's see here. We'll move right along here, and I want to share some other tidbits of information with you folks here. And what I want you to do here, let's take a look at 1860 Alabama. The population, this is 1820 Alabama. Population in 1820 in Alabama, it included 41,000 slaves. But watch what happens in a scant 40 years. In 40 years, the number of slaves in Alabama is 435,000. You can do the math on that. Let's look at Mississippi. In Mississippi, the number of slaves in 1820 is 32,000 slaves. 32,000 slaves. But by 1860, it even surpasses Alabama. 436,000 slaves in Mississippi in a short 40 years. Now watch what happens to Virginia. Now in Virginia, in 1820, Virginia had 425,000 slaves. Now watch what happens here. By 1860, Virginia has 490,000 slaves. So it did go up. The number of slaves in Virginia did increase, but nothing compared to the rate of increase of what you're going to see in the deep South in Alabama and Mississippi. It was like, I forget, it was like 400,000 slaves were carried from the upper north, transported from the upper north into the lower South, or from the upper South into the lower South. All right, so anyway, okay, so the South developed quite a bit differently than that of the North, and I don't know. I like to visit in the North, and I do so just about every year. It's not a place I want to live, but you know, I like to go up to the northern states there and rub elbows with those people there. They're different from us, and I'm sure that if you've traveled up to the North, you've experienced that. They like to make fun of you, like to make fun of us and the way that we speak in the South, which I see nothing wrong with the way we speak. I think everything in the North sounds funny, to tell you the truth with that. All right, so anyway, the South developed quite differently than that of the North. In the South, we were more in tune with chivalry, that's horsemanship, leisure, elegance. Southerners like to talk, like to sit around and talk about sports, or talk about war, or whatever your favorite subject is. It's important in the South, and certainly back in the 1840s, to defend your honor. You always had to defend your honor. You always had to stand up for a female and defend the rights of a female, too. That was just a part of it. I don't think you'd be one bit surprised if I told you that dueling persisted in the South much longer than it did in the North here. Many in the South here went to the military academies here, much more so than that in the North. Let's see here. I'm trying to get my paper straightened up here. You can't read my writing here, so I have to tell you about this, but you'll find a predominance of Southerners, cadets that will be at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And we will also have the vast majority of the student body cadets at Virginia Military Institute. They were from the South. They were from the South. So Southerners had much more a propensity to go into the military. All right, and what's going to take place here is that when the Civil War breaks out, the South does much better than the North for the first several months because they have better leaders. Their leaders came out of West Point, came out of Virginia Military Institute with that. Well, after about 2 years, most of them were killed off, so it kind of equalized things with that too. All right, so moving right along, and I want to share some things here with you here, folks. This is not found, I don't think this is found in your textbook, but I always ask my classes when we're face-to-face with each other, how many of you actually think that every person in the South was a slave owner during this time frame of 1840s, 50s, or 60s? And almost inevitably, I'll find, 2/3 of the class or 80% of the class will raise their hands with that. And I want to share some facts with you here, and then we'll try to clear some things up with this too. But these are actual figures here, and I believe this is in your textbook, by the way. In 1850, in the South, there were 6 million white people. 6 million white people. And we had at that time, there were 348,000 slave owners. And I rounded it off for you there, folks. So if you don't believe me, you get out your calculator and you do some quick calculating on that, and you'll find that this comes out to less than 6% of the population were slave owners. Less than 6% were slave owners. All right, now that's 1850. Let's move on up to 1860 here. In 1860. By this time, Southern population in the South, white population is 8 million white people, and we had 384,000. I rounded those numbers off here, folks. 380,000 here slave owners. So if we calculate that, that means we have less than 5% of the Southern population were slave owners. And I'm not even talking about the 3,775 free blacks that owned 12,740 slaves. That's not what you hear, and that's not what we understand here. That's not what your teachers have taught you likewise here, folks. But those are accurate figures with that too. So really, it was only a small population in the South that were slave owners with that. You got to remember here, and I didn't do it for you good folks here because we're going through some sensitive times in our country, and I just did not feel like doing this. But ordinarily, for my face-to-face classes, I bring in some slave deeds, and these are some that my grandfather, who passed along to me. He was a collector of things, coin collector, and just collected everything. And I guess I inherited that same characteristic because I'm a collector of everything too. But anyway, I would ordinarily bring out some slave deeds for you folks, and they're treasured items and very, very expensive here. But you would see that the average price to a slave was somewhere about $500 to about $1,500 per slave. Now, if we calculate that in today's standards, by 2020, what does $1,000 equate to then in 1860 to what it equates to today in 2020? It's about $50,000. So the average price of a slave today was about $50,000. Then was equivalent to $50,000 a day. So $50,000, per slave. So what does that mean? Can your average dirt farmer in the South afford a slave? And the answer to that, quite frankly, is no. They cannot do that too. Too expensive with that. Did it exist? Of course it existed here. We can't defy history on that. As much as we try to undergo revisionist history, we can't change the fact that took place here. But let me show you where we get into a problem with this here, class. What constitutes a slave owner? If we have a husband and we have a wife and they have 5 children, how many slaves do we have? Or I should say, how many slave owners do we have? Husband, wife, 5 children, and one of those children is 2 months old. Is that child, if you have slaves, is that child a slave owner? And it all depends on our interpretation with this. Some of you would say, absolutely, we have 7 slave owners in that family. And others would say, oh no, it's the head of the household, it's the father that is a slave owner. So I can't give you hard, cold numbers on this other than what I gave you a while ago here, folks. And you just have to draw your own determination and conclusions from that. All right, so let's move on here and let's see what else we've got here. All right, so I'm going to leave that here. And let's move on with a couple of other things here. Southern belles, southern ladies here, young ladies as they were often referred to as. Not a great deal different from their northern counterparts, not very well educated, but that was just a characteristic of the South. You just did not find many females that were educated during that time. Most Southerners just referred to themselves as plain folk. And about 90% of the Southern population were nothing more than just plain folk. I still hear people say it today. We just plain folks. We just plain folks. Okay. Now, the title that is given to slavery in the South is a peculiar institution. And don't ask me why, because I don't know. That's just what the slavery was referred to as a peculiar institution. If you're careful and observe it when you're reading documents from that period of time, you'll run across this term, the peculiar institution here. But anyway, it's one of those things that the South is so closely identified with here, folks, that issue of slavery. And I guess I understand that, but it's just kind of puzzling to me in some ways with that. But at this time that we're talking about here, it was only the South and Cuba and Brazil that still practiced slavery. They still had slavery there. And in the South, we only had slaves that were brought in to South Carolina and to Georgia here. All right, so let's go back here and let's see here. What else? Often we find that slave codes would be established here. Let me give you some of these slave codes, and you don't need to write these down, and I don't write them down for my class either. Slaves could not own property. However, some did, but that was a rare thing. Slaves could not leave the premises without the master's permission. Slaves could not be out after dark. You could not strike a white person. You could be severely beaten or even killed for that. Could not congregate at church or at work. Could not carry a weapon. Slaves could not be taught to read or write. Some could, some were, but in many states some states it was illegal. There were no provisions to legalize slave marriages or divorces. As part of our wedding vows, we say, "Until death do we part," and what you said in the slave wedding vows was, "Until distance do us part." If you had a trace of African ancestry, you were considered to be black. All right, let's move right along here. There were ordinarily two methods of work. We had one method, which is called the task system, and you find this more so like in areas of Georgia and South Carolina where rice was the principal crop here. Here's what I want you to do under the task system. Go out and hoe an acre, something such as that. When you're through, you're through. But what was more common was the gang system. The gang system, and this is what we commonly think, particularly if you follow Gone with the Wind or something like that, in which slaves would rise early in the morning. A trusted slave driver, and that's the title that they were referred to as, would lead the slaves into the cotton fields, work all day, and at the end of the day, back to the slave quarters that you would go, being led by the slave driver. And for females, that's when your second job began, because that's when you had to do your cooking, the cleaning, just the domestic chores here. All right. Household servants always had a better way of life. Generally speaking, there was less labor involved in this. Might even get to live in a big house, and that's what it was referred to as, the plantation house here. All right. We had approximately 250,000 free blacks. Most were present in the areas of Virginia or in Maryland. There were a few free black communities. Did I write this down here? I did. A few free black communities, such as you can find in New Orleans, Natchez, and Charleston. If you were in Arkansas did not permit free blacks. So if you gained your freedom as a slave and gained your freedom, you had to leave the state of Arkansas. All right, there were a number of slave markets that were present here, and I just wrote down a few of these. Mobile, Natchez, Memphis, New Orleans had over 200 dealerships here. Charleston, South Carolina, I think, had 50 dealerships. Galveston, and I've just listed a few of those. All right. Slaves could expect to be sold at least once in a lifetime. And here, I made the note for you right here. Slaves sold for about $500 to about $1,700 here. All right, taken to a slave market where You would be transported, and you want to have a slave to be sold to arrive in the best condition as possible here. All methods were used to try to disguise the age of the slave here. We'll take coal dust, put the coal dust in the hair, particularly if you have someone that has silver hair or white hair, just trying to disguise the age of the individual. On the slave block, the slave auction block, very humiliating, strip down of your clothes there, and examine your teeth, examine your eyes and your ears, check the musculature on an individual, see how high the individual can jump here, look at the back, and particularly look at the back to see if there are any scarification there, scars there. This indicates that the slave had to be flogged or whipped here, and the dollar value, of course, would go remarkably low with that here. Sexually attractive young female slave sold for the topmost dollar here. All right, here, and a lot of molestation which would take place on these plantations. Okay, let's see what we have here, folks. I'm trying to wrap this up, and we're running out of time a little bit. A couple of slave revolts that took place. Nat Turner in 1831. I think I have a likeness here of Nat Turner. Here's an artist rendering here who staged a slave revolt, and this took place in Southampton County, Virginia. That's down there in Hampton, Newport News, in that area here. But if I had more time, I would tell you about Nat Turner. He was a visionary. He'd never been taught to read or write, but according to his grandmother, one day he sat down at a breakfast table and just started reading. He was a religious individual, and on this occasion in 1831, there was alcohol involved in this, but Nat Turner and a number of other followers went through Southampton County, Virginia. I don't know if I wrote it down for you here, and killed 57 to 60 white people here. Killed them with hatchets, and just murdered them in cold blood. Another slave uprising took place 1822 with Denmark Vesey, which is so very odd here because Denmark Vesey had won his freedom in a lottery, but he staged a slave revolt, and the plans were discovered, and Denmark Vesey and a number of others were summarily executed. Never did tell you here on Nat Turner. All of those individuals involved with Nat Turner and himself were eventually caught, and they were all beheaded. Their heads were taken place upon fence posts here. Okay, I always ask my class, if you were a slave, would you try to run away? And the answer always is yes. But I'm asking you a question here, folks. If you said yes, where does freedom lie? Where would you go? Where would you go? You're here in Alabama, and I'll use my map back here, and it looks like I moved it around. Well, where is your freedom? And your freedom, let's look at this. Your freedom, if you're in Alabama right here, your freedom is north of the Mason-Dixon line, which is right up here. So this means somehow you've got to make your way up the north of the Ohio River. You don't know how to read. You don't have a compass. If you had a compass, you can't read the compass. You have no maps that are available to you. Slave patrols are out. Any black that is walking down a road will be apprehended and questioned with that. So it's a lot easier to say, yes, I would try to get away, than it is in reality here. But often we make use of such things, and particularly if you were in like Virginia or Maryland, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, such as what Harriet Tubman is associated with this. Good book here associated with this, The Underground Railroad. And if you were here, you could thumb through that book. All right. Now, I want to take just a few seconds here. I'm through with the lecture, but I want to take a few seconds here and show you some photographs that I would have available for you if you were in my class here, folks. Here is a likeness here showing you Harriet Tubman. There's also an advertisement there for selling slaves. Let's see here. Here's another one here. Did I get it upside down? I did. It's selling slaves at Hewitt and Bright. Hewlett and Bright, valuable slaves. If you read through these, and you can't see these very well, you'll see that almost all of those slaves there are mulattoes, and that was just part of it at that time. Some other photographs, and these all date back to the 1850s, 1860s here, showing you slaves outside of the slave quarters there. No air conditioning, of course. Children and adults that had intestinal parasites, rotten teeth. And let's see what else I have here. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. There we go. Seems like I'd catch on to this, folks, after 18 lectures here. All right, photographs of slaves from that particular period of time. All right, on we go here with more here, showing you slaves here. These are actual photographs, 1850s, 1860s. Okay, and we can see more that This is after the Northern Army had moved through Georgia anyway, and you can't really say these are emancipated slaves at this time. Well, maybe you can, but anyway, if you notice, it looks like some black men back there in Northern uniforms. Those are just uniforms that the North just left with the people because they were so poorly clothed. All right, more photographs from that period of time here. All right. So anyway, and that's enough of that anyway. All right, so that's going to conclude this lecture here, folks. We're well on our way into the third block of instruction. So stay with it now. Okay? All right, thank you.